washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Released from the chains, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was ransomed, He faithfully bore. He canceled my debt and He called me His friend. When death was arrested, my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Savior displayed on a criminal's cross. Darkness rejoices, though heaven had lost. But when Jesus rose with our freedom in hand, that's when death was arrested and our life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. No, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the free. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested and my life began. Yeah, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the free. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested, my life began. When death was arrested, my life began. When death was arrested, my life began. Christ the sure and steady anchor in the fury of the storm. When the winds of doubt blow through me and my sails are all been torn, in the suffering and the sorrow, when my sinking hopes are few, I will hold fast to the anchor. It shall never be removed. The calm will be the better for the storms that we endure. Christ the shore of our salvation, ever faithful, ever true. We will hold fast to the anchor, it shall never be removed.
Praise God. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my heart, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust. Father God, thank you, Lord, for this day. Thank you for being here, Lord God. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your Son, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus, that you came and died for us and rose again and sit at the right hand of God the Father, interceding for us. Thank you for the word that is going to be spoken today, Lord. I pray that our hearts are ready to receive it. And I pray that our lives are ready to apply it. Thank you for your goodness and mercy. Because truly, we are blessed when we put our trust in you. Amen.
You guys turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings 18 this morning. So the question came out again today in the first service, and I know you guys were thinking about this last week, and I didn't tell you, why in the world have we TP'd the trees? Why did we do that? You just know it looks so beautiful, right, Sydney? So why would you do that? Have you ever had someone come to your house and TP your yard? TP, y'all know what that means, right? Toilet paper, your yard, right? So, it was just a constant thing. When I was in high school, people were getting TP'd all the time. It's like you didn't want to be that parent that your kid was so popular that people chose to TP your yard. You know, how do you look at that? How do you look at that TPing? You know, is it something that you're like, wow, that's awesome, people love me so much they've become in toilet paper in my yard? You know, the whole toilet paper thing. If you get there before it rains, or I guess here before it snows, you know, you can either pull it out of trees, or a lot of people choose, if it's not like super dry outside, choose to just take a lighter and light into that toilet paper, and it goes way up in those trees, and it'll just burn it all the way up, and it's an easy way to get down. But if the rain comes, and I guess maybe the snow comes, before you get it down, I mean, you're like for weeks, or when after the snow season is over, you're just like forever going out there trying to pick up all those little pieces. Or maybe you might just decide, hey, it's too much, I'm just going to mow it in and mulch it, right? When that season finally gets here. You know, how do you look at that? Do you filter that through, wow, this is awesome, I have friends that love me, or oh my goodness, this is just awful, people hate me, you know? Is it something like, that's pretty cool, I'm a little upset, but that's kind of cool, that's kind of fun. I want to know who it is so I can go TP them too. You know, in the first service we had a couple of people that admitted they were the ones that did the TP. You know, so this morning on the way to church, you guys stepped outside. You probably stepped outside before you came to church, and you're like, "Whoa, it's cold." Or maybe you just woke up and you realized just from sticking your head out from underneath the blanket, you're like, "Oh my goodness, it's cold." You know, it's like, I don't know, -6 or something like that. You know, this morning where we live, probably I guess maybe the same thing here in Brunswick, and just really cold. And you're like, those kind of days, how do you process that? I mean, we've had a very mild winter, right? It's been very mild, very easy for the most part. And then all of a sudden, winter decided to kind of show up here, getting ready to go into February. And this morning, I was like, I don't like this. We just came on the way out the door, which car are we taking? We have the extra truck, so we can do plowing for the church and stuff, but which one are we taking? I said, we're taking the Tahoe. So I'm trying to quickly, as she's already to the car, I'm trying to get there quickly so I can unlock the Tahoe so she can get in. I do that, I crank it, and then I'm like, I didn't feed the chickens. I mean, don't we all have to feed the chickens before we go to church? Y'all all did that this morning, right? I'm probably the only one showed up today had to do that. But I was like, I got to feed the chickens. So I leave the car, the truck running, and I leave the door open, and I do the quick feeding of the chickens, and trying to get it all done fast because we try to get here by like 8:15, and at this point I'm kind of pushing it, or we're going to make it on time. And so get in the truck, finish all that, get in the truck, shut the door. It's not warm at all. It's like, did you even turn the heat on? No, we did, but it wasn't nearly as much time. I look, there's a little bit of frost in the windshield, and y'all know, where this is going. You've been here long enough. The boys, he ain't right, he's from Georgia. So a little bit of frost on the windshield. I'm like, we can do this. The sun wasn't hitting the windshield, right? So it didn't seem like a big deal. And so we go, and I'm thinking, it'll be gone quickly. And the sun hits us when we turn around to the front part of our driveway and going down towards the road. I'm like, it's kind of hard to see. I look over at Kate and I said, it'll be fine because, we're running parallel to the sun for the first, whatever part of our drive, and then we're going to turn and face the sun the rest of the way to the church. And sure enough, we get onto River Road, make that first turn, and bam, sun, just a little bit of frost, but the way it hits the windshield, y'all know this. I wouldn't have thought about this because I didn't think about frost, but it hits the windshield, you can't see a thing. But I kept looking as I'm driving, find a spot that I could look through just a little bit, and I could see it just a little bit, so long as the sun didn't change its angle. Head up, head to the stop sign. Katie says, we're getting ready to the stop sign. She says, I can get out the stop sign and clear the window. I was like, no, it'll be fine. A lot of it, there's trees and stuff, and we'll be good. Well, we get up to that first hill on River Road, and just past that, and it's good going up the hill, and as soon as you get to the other side of the hill, it's like, bam, there was no way to see anything. And so what I do, I put the blinker on, and I quickly got off. I knew there was no one behind me, so I just quickly kind of really stopped in the middle of the road, got over a little bit, stopped. But before I did that, I did the wise thing. I thought, I'm going to drive a little bit, with the window down like this. Have y'all ever done that? I mean, thank you. I'm not the only one. It's easier than getting out and scraping the windshield. And it's going to warm up enough a little bit. I kept asking Katie, because I'm looking through the hole before the hole was disappeared. Is the defrost, is it working yet? Is it showing up? No, it's not. Well, I let the window down, and I'm trying to do this, and then we just stop. I get out, take my glove, because I don't know where a scraper is. Do a little bit of, hard things. I got a little section now that I can see. Get back in the truck, put the seatbelt on and go, and then I do this to get the window up, the little power button. Window ain't moving. It is doggone -6 outside without the windshield of your truck going 45 miles an hour and the window down. It's already -6. Finally, I'm like, Katie, would you hold the steering wheel, get to a straightaway? Would you hold the steering wheel? And so she's holding the steering wheel, and I'm doing this with one hand, the other hand, I got my gloves on, I'm trying to pull the window up, because we've had problems with the window before. It's not a big deal, because you just remember, don't let the window down in the winter. you let your wife drive in the passenger seat, and you, for like almost the whole way, whenever it's straight, you just like trying to pull the thing up. And somebody decided all day to pull out in front of us, and they decided they'd give 35. And I'm like, I want to get there. I'm cold. And finally, by the point, I'm just trying to drive. Forget the window. And they're slow. I'm thinking, I want to get this hurt over with. You know, I just want to get there. And look at the truck still sitting out there with the window down. We're going to try to get it up before we go home. But how do you process this? How do you process the mess? How do you process the thing that you prayed for, that you hoped for, that you asked God for, and it's just not working out the way you hoped? How do you, in that setting, it's like, welcome to Maine, I said that this morning, and it's like, oh, good grief, But I'm like, it'll be a good story one day. And I was thinking one day, not today, but it'll be a good story one day. So how are you going to process that? How is God working in the middle of the mess? When you hear cancer, when you find out that person you love is sick, when you find out they passed away, when you find out you get the peace slip, when you've lost your job, when the marriage comes to the end, how do you process the conflict between you and this person? How do you process these things? The mess in your life. How does God view this? How is God working in this? In what way could God maybe be using this in my life as a blessing to draw me, or maybe to draw other people towards God? I think it's a question that God would want us to consider. As we look to the text today, we're kind of quickly go back to where we were last week, and we kind of catch back up, and we're going to move forward. But as we come to the text, just kind of a little background, but we didn't talk about last week, as you think about Ahab, as we talk about this guy, Ahab, the king of Israel, who wasn't following God. Before we got to him, we got to a place before that where God had set up a covenant with his people, and God's plan with his people was that God would rule their hearts. That God would rule their nation. That God would rule them. And they didn't need a king. But they kept calling for a king. And finally, at some point, God gave them judges. But they weren't happy with that. And they're like, we want a king. We want to follow a king. We want to be like everybody else, all the other nations. We want to be strong and powerful and mighty. And we want a king. And God's like, I'm your king. We want a king. So God gives them a king. You remember the first king of Israel? What was his name? Yeah, Saul. First king of Israel. You got a time where he seemed to be doing okay, but then the guy kind of went crazy. And gave a picture for the Israelites, if they missed it, gave them a picture for what they would deal with for the rest of the time. And what we still deal with today when we have flawed people trying to lead us. And if you don't realize that on a national level, think about your home. When you've got a flawed person, you trying to lead your family or lead yourself. And what happens there? And so Saul was the first king, and he had some troubles. He had some issues. He didn't always walk with God. He was not exactly a godly person in the way he ruled and reigned for the most part. And then eventually you have the second king of Israel. What's his name? Y'all know? David. All right, second guy. He was David. David, you think of a man after God's own heart. But this guy, had his list of sins himself. And he didn't always get it right. He tried to for much of his rule, much of his reign, but he didn't always get it right. Again, show that the real king that God desired for his people, including us, is him, is God, is Jesus, is him ruling and reigning in our hearts. But they get to a third king. Third king was Solomon, which was David's son. Kind of weak king, if you will. And after his reign, if you will, kind of ended with the kingdom of Israel splitting. Like, the northern folks couldn't get along with the southern people. Y'all never heard of that, had you? Or vice versa. So the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel, they split. The northern kingdom was known as Israel. The southern kingdom was known as Judah. And so we're not going to talk about Southern Kingdom right now today, the next couple of weeks. Didn't last week, not going to today. The Northern Kingdom, one of the kings that they would have, his name was Ahab, and we looked at this guy last week. Ahab was a guy who just never really cared to try to follow God. He kind of did his own thing. And he kind of brought, his wife's gods, Jezebel was her name. You guys, if you've been around church for a while, you're a little familiar with Jezebel. If you're not, I encourage you to read about her. It's pretty interesting. She was not walking with God. She was not a godly influence on her husband, nor was he a godly influence on her. By the way, if you ever have a child going to have a grandbaby for you, if you're ever going to have another baby, don't name your kid Jezebel. Not a good choice. Known people back home call Jezebel for their child. Like, come on, y'all, read your Bible. Don't do that. But anyhow, so Ahab though and Jezebel, they're not walking with God, and they're following these false gods. And we kind of get like a number. If you look in 1 Kings chapter 18 and you look at verse 19, you would see there were 450 prophets of Baal, and there were 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. That's a mighty big old table, right? And so these people, Ahab was not walking with God. He was not leading the people of God to walk with God. He was an evil king. He was a vile king. And by the way, God will hold us accountable for the way we do what He's called us to do. For the way we walk with Him, the way we lead, the way if you're a boss, He's going to hold you accountable for the way you lead your company. If you are an employee, He's going to hold you accountable for the way you do your work. If you are a father, He's going to hold you. He's going to hold us responsible for the things He's entrusted to us. He will hold kings responsible for them being king, to rule. Our president, our past presidents, they will be accountable. They will be accountable for the way they rule. We all will. And so we find here this guy, Ahab, God decides, because he's not walking with God, God decides to raise up this prophet that we looked at last week, Elijah, to actually be God's mouthpiece, to go to the king, to go to him and tell him, you've not been walking with God. Because you've not been walking with God, because you're an evil king, and God's calling you to change, but you're going to change, and God already knows this, so God's already decided He's going to bring a famine, He's going to stop the rain, He's going to bring a famine on the land. And the people are going to suffer, and you're going to suffer, and your kingdom reign is going to suffer. And, as we talked about briefly last week, Elijah, he's going to suffer too. It wasn't that he was going to somehow make this decree that God's going to give him a chance to go to Jamaica. It wasn't that he was going to make this king and then he got to go spend, time in some, nice island somewhere where there's plenty of coconuts and pineapple or whatever else there is. He's going to go through this too. And we looked at last week how Elijah, he made this decree to the king, and then God provided a way for him to be provided for. And he says, hey, I want you to go and follow me where I lead you. And God led him to a little stream, a little brook. And when you get there, when that's your time and you're going through that hard time and this happens to you, the mess happens to you, our view of it, maybe sometimes you handle it pretty well, but a lot of times we get there and we're like, God, I understand it's going to be a hard time. And in this setting, this is because of the king, and he's not following you, and he's leading people to not follow you, and he's the one you're punishing. Why do I have to go through this too? Can I just kind of get a plane pass to go somewhere, nice for a few years? Why don't you just deal with these people? But he gets this little brook in a drought, and you're like, okay, well, have you ever made suggestions to God as the way how to rule your life? That's what I would do. We didn't see Elijah doing that. That's what I would do. That's what I have done. And I'm admitting that it's not something to brag on, but I'm hoping you will think about your life and how am I doing this? How well do I do in the mess? How well do I do when there's chaos? How well do I do? Do I stress? Do I worry? Or do I trust God? Do I worry such that, like when you get hungry, what do? A lot of times we get angry. My wife put something on my Facebook this week for the whole kids element about a lot of the work arguments, 80% or something. I don't know what percentage came from. But 80% of the argument's going to be stopped if we just weren't hungry. Like when there's a fight at home, you remember when you're raising kids and somebody got mad? Well, if you just feed them and give them sleep, they'll be okay, right? And so in this setting, when you're stressed, when you're tense, when it's not working the way you hope it would work out, how do we respond? A lot of times the way we respond is the person that's closest to us will experience the fact that we're stressed. They will know it by our response, by our relationship, by the conflict. Well, Elijah, he's just got a little creep. And he's just got, he's got not only that, he's got these ravens that God said, hey, I'm going to lead the ravens to come and feed you bread and meat. And yeah, we talked about this last week. Well, I would have preferred something a little different. If it was me, I would prefer maybe even a lunch lady or something, but something a little better than a raven bringing something that it found who knows where from something that's been dead for who knows how long, and I got to eat this. And it's probably you probably thought I was a baby ravenette and want to chew a little bit before it came to me. I know, right? And so all this works out, and the little brook dries up, and God's like, okay, yeah, I'm going to send you Elijah, man of God. I'm going to send you to a widow. That's the point where you'd be like, that's awesome. I'm going to help this person. I'm going to work this thing out for her. I'm going to show her the goodness of God. I'm going to provide for her. This is cool. And God's like, no, Elijah, I'm going to use her to provide for you. She's going to feed you. And you get there and you see that she's not this rich person. We talked about this last one too. And she's poor. She says to him, she's not exactly a ray of sunshine. What are you doing? I'm gathering this wood to put together my last meal for my son and myself, and then we're going to die. God, couldn't you send me to the sunny, cheerful person? We're going to have our last meal. It's going to be awesome. You want to eat with us? And so we give these suggestions to God, or we deal with this conflict or whatever in our own way, and it reveals a lot about the way we view God. And for a lot of us, yes, we trust God, but when we get tested, there at least is a season, there is a window, there's a time where that trust, it's there, but maybe it's tested. I trust you, but the way I'm showing that I'm trusting you isn't showing that I'm trusting you fully. Elijah goes through this, and eventually, the woman's son dies, and because of a sickness, and she makes this accusation. By this point, God's been providing for her and for her son because of Elijah being there, that her food supply just never ran out, even though they thought they were going to just eat one last meal and die. It's not running out, but eventually, she does what we do when we're stressed. We forget the past goodness and faithfulness of God. When all of a sudden it's not going our way, when the prayers aren't being answered the way we want them answered, the provision is not the way we had hoped it would be, when the relationship's not working out the way we'd hoped the relationship would be working out, we forget the past goodness and faithfulness of God. We forget that we are experiencing one day in the bigger scheme of His goodness and His story in our life. And so in that moment, she forgets, oh, we got bread to eat every day. Well, her son is dead. Let's give her a little break, right? And she calls out, why have you come here to curse me? And why have you killed my son? And then Elijah takes this conversation and goes, God, why did you do this? Why did you kill her son? And where are you, God? And then he stops. He does what we should do when we realize, oh, I'm wrong. God's right. I question His faithfulness. I question His goodness. Good and He's faithful. And then what do? We stop and we turn the prayer around. We confess and we ask God to work it out in His way. In this situation, the son came back to life. God answered the prayer of Elijah, and her declaration at the end of the story, where she's in the story, the very end, the last verse of verse 24 of chapter 17, look how she makes this point. She says, now, after her son comes back to life, after she has gone from accusing Elijah, and by that accusing his God, her God, of not being faithful, then she comes back and says, I know you are a man of God, and the Lord's word from your mouth is true. And so we see this heart change because, oh, I missed the perspective, and yes, I missed the perspective, and yes, I didn't view the situation the way God would have me to view it, and maybe I didn't correct my way, but God in His goodness, He showed me His grace. And God showed her grace, and her son came back to life, and God made this clear, and now she's singing the praises of God. That's the way it should be. When God shows us we've stepped out of bounds, and God calls us on our sin, and God still works in spite of our not being faithful to Him, then we should declare, God, you're good, you're faithful. You are the true God. And she does this. But Elijah, the story goes on. And of course, we know her story went on too. We don't see the rest of it. But the story goes on. We find, as we look at chapter 18, first verse, we see a period of time has gone by. Look at what it says. It says, verse 1 of chapter 18, after a long time, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year. Now, he says a long time. Now, before this year that we just experienced, you know, 3 years is a big deal, right? You know, you can deal with something stressful for 3 years. But how many of us have whined and complained and been upset and angry about the last year, and it's not even been a year yet? If you haven't, I have done plenty for you. So that will give you, it's not even a year that we've been going through this, that will give you a little perspective of what, 3 years of things not working out in a big way, the way you hoped they would work out. And this was Elijah, this was the people of Israel, this was King Ahab, this was their experience for 3 years. This intense warfare, battle, calamity, things not working out, famine, people getting sick, people were dying because there wasn't food. And then Elijah, in the middle of this, look at what happens here. Verse 1. After a long time, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Isn't that, again, the goodness? Do you see how rich that verse is? Doesn't that display the richness and the goodness and the faithfulness of God in the midst of the stress? In the midst of me not processing it the way I should, that I'm going through this hard time, even accusing God sometimes of not being faithful, here is God speaking into that. His word still speaking. God still active in my life. And so, like, here he's saying, in the midst of this, the word of the Lord has come to Elijah saying, look what he says. Go and present yourself to Ahab. I will send rain on the surface of the land. Now, if that were me, and probably if it were you, as soon as he says, go to Ahab, I'd be like, oh my goodness, no, I don't want to do that, God. I wouldn't have heard the next part of that verse where he says, I will send rain to the land. I would not have heard that because I would have been fixated on that. What? I've got to go to this king who sought to kill me? I don't want to do that. And we question the will of God. I'm admitting this, with a heart that's, I know that I'm wrong in doing that. But I'll be like, I can't hear the next part. I can't hear the blessing of you sending rain because all I can see is this barrier. All I can see is the mess. And that's the way we do this, right? I can't see the little blessing. It's a big blessing. I can't see the rain coming. I can't see that blessing. I can't see that he's a big God. I was like, oh my goodness, I got to stand up to this guy, Ahab? You're going to send me to Ahab? Because I'm going to send you to Ahab, but I'm also going to send rain on the surface of the land. So Elijah, verse 2, went to present himself to Ahab. You see that there? Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. He went. And that's really what God desires for us to do too. When God calls us to something, we're like, no, I'm not sure that's the best way for you to work this thing out. God's like, no, I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked for your obedience. And so he went. He went to the king. He went to King Ahab. And if you were to look at chapter 18, you would look at the first few verses, you would see this other guy here. His name is Obadiah. Obadiah was a servant of the Lord. His name actually means servant of the Lord. He was a follower of the one true God. He was this guy who worked for the king. The king rules, and you got to do what you're supposed to do. He works for the king, but the king's wife, Jezebel, she's seeking to kill every prophet she can find, prophet of God that she can find, so she can prop up her false prophets. And so she's seeking, and she's killing hundreds of prophets. And this guy, Obadiah, when he can find a prophet, he's the prophet of God, the true God. He's hiding these guys. And you see his story here where he hit 150 at a time. And this guy knew that this king that he served was a way bad guy, an evil guy. He knew this. He knew that for Elijah, when he made this decree about the famine, he knew that the king sought to kill him. And eventually, the resources are so slim for King Ahab. If the king is starting to experience shortages, you know it's bad, right? The king, his shortages are so bad that he's like, I'm going to have to choose to either feed my horses or my cows. My horses that are going to keep my army strong so that we can pull our chariots and go into battle. I'm going to either feed them or I'm going to feed my cows. And so we've got to find some more food. And so he sets out one way and sends Obadiah another direction to go find food. And on the path to go find food, Obadiah runs into Elijah. Because what? Elijah is on his way to see the king. And Elijah tells Obadiah, he says to him, hey, go to the king and tell him that I want to see him. Tell him I'm coming. Now Obadiah at that point is like, hey, what are you doing? You trying to kill me? Why would he say that? Because you read on, you find in chapter 18, he says, you trying to kill me because I know the last time the king came after you, you went and hid. And I'm going to go tell the king you're coming, and he's going to hold me to that, and you're going to go hide again. And he knew this king was bad. He's like, I don't want to do that. And Elijah makes this promise. He says, as surely as the Lord lives, I will not hide. I will come and go to the king. Why? Because God had sent him. He didn't leave the first time because he was a coward. He left the first time because God had another plan for him. And God said, get out of there. And now God's telling him to go back. And so he went back and he was going to keep his word. And he did keep his word. And when he finally got to the king, we find in 1 Kings 18, he says in verse 15, he says, Elijah said, as he comes, before he gets to the king, he says, as surely as the Lord of the armies lives of Israel, in whose presence I stand today, I will present myself to Ahab. And so Obadiah is like, okay, I trust you. And he went and told the king. And then Elijah comes, verse 17, before the king, and the king says, Ahab says, is that you, the one ruining Israel? Is that you, O troubler of Israel? Now we know the true troubler of Israel was King Ahab, who was not ruling justly, who was not following God, who was leading the people of God to not follow God. But this guy, because he was set in his ways, and this is what we do as adults, we get set in our ways, and we don't like anybody telling us that we need to change, right? You tell somebody that's an adult who's been living as long as you, or older, they're longer than you, and you tell them they need to cook that thing a different way and see what kind of response you get. You're going to be eating ramen noodle fried, something. You can be making your own rice-a-roni or something. You tell that person, you drive them too slow, what they're going to do. If they're like me, they're going to drive slower. I know, isn't this bad? You thought they were just the only one. You thought you were the only one. And here he is, he's gone one time and told this king he needs to change his ways, and now he's come back to this king, and guess what? Has the king changed? No. Is the king following God? And this is something here. Usually, what we find is when God says, I'm going to withhold like the rain, and he brings calamity because of the sin. It's not because God's not good, but because God is judging your sin. When we sin, we deal with the consequences of our sin, right? We might be forgiven as a child of God, and God's taken away, our eternal consequences, which is separation from God because of our sin. But we can still deal with the consequences of our sin right here. If you have an argument with someone, you sinned against them, guess what? You might be sleeping on the couch. You might get fired from your job. You get what I'm saying? And so here is Elijah coming back to this king who's not changed, who's not reformed his ways. And here's God saying, I'm going to bring rain. He doesn't say I'll bring rain if the king changes. He says, I'm sending you back and I'm going to bring rain. And as proof of this, here's God bringing his man before this king and saying, hey, you're still not following God. And Elijah comes and says, okay, yeah, right, what? He didn't say this, but I would be thinking, yeah, you calling me the trouble, and you the trouble of Israel. Excuse me, you are. You are the trouble of Israel. And so he says to the king, he's like, hey, you get all your prophets. You get all the 450 prophets of Baal, verse 19, we've already looked at it. You get the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. You get Jezebel. You get all the people of Israel. And you get all these folks and yourself. And y'all come on, let's meet at Carmel. Let's meet this spot. And in their minds, they would be thinking, okay, this was a place where there had been an altar to the Lord, where God had been worshipped in the past. And by this time, they've got their own altars. And the altar of God had been torn down. And so they had to kind of think where this is going. And so as you read on, you'll find in chapter 18, verse 20, Ahab did it. He summoned all the Israelites, all the prophets of Baal, and brought them to Carmel, to Mount Carmel. And all these people, this is happening. This is going down. And Elijah is giving them an opportunity to see which God is true. Baal, these false gods, or God. And so what we find here, we see Elijah approaching the people. Verse 21, he says to them, how long will you waver between two opinions? He's not just saying this to the king, he's saying this to the people, to everyone gathered. The king, the people, the false prophets. He's saying this to everyone gathered. He says, if the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people didn't say a word. They didn't answer. Why? Because they weren't sure. Maybe they had heard about it. Maybe they'd been brought up in homes where they were to believe the one true God, but they weren't following him. And so in this setting, Elijah says to the people, I am the only remaining, verse 22, I am the only remaining prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. So he says, let 2 bulls be brought to us. Let 2 bulls be given to us. And they chose 1 bull for themselves, the false prophets, 450 of them, cut it into pieces. And at this point, we're like, whoa, this is kind of weird. What's going on? And if you've grown up in church, or if you've read the Bible, if you haven't, I'll just help you understand, that the system for the people of God at this time was they were to give offerings to God, burnt sacrifices. And they would sacrifice, a lot of times a good bull. We would see other times it might be like a sheep or whatever. But in this setting, it was a bull. And so these other people following their false gods, they kind of followed the same kind of thing where they make these sacrifices to their gods. And they call it worship. They were trying to substitute worship for one true God for their own thing. And so they knew what was going down. Briefly, for a little bit rather. Okay, we're going to make a sacrifice to our God, Baal. You get one, and he says to them, you get one, you get your wood put together, and you put that sacrifice, that bull, those pieces on top of that. And then he says, you call out. You guys all, I'm just one. I'm one person. But you guys, all 450 of you, y'all call out to your God and ask him to consume the sacrifice. You got it up on your altar, ask him. And as a matter of fact, this seemed like it would be an easy thing because Baal actually was considered to be the god of storms. And so the god of storm, you think lightning, right? Lightning. So lightning, just all you got to do is get your little god. It's been dry. You get your little god to call up a storm. Get him to call up a storm and bring down lightning and consume this fire. And hey, that's going to be pretty cool. For you think. You think it's going to work. You do it. You do it. You do that very thing. And so they did that. They called out, reading on, you find where they took the bull, verse 26, then he gave them and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, Baal, answer us. But there was no sound. No one answered. Then they danced around the altar they had made. And later on, Elijah, he's taunting and saying, hey, you guys, I don't think that he hears you. Why don't you shout a little louder? Why don't you just shout a little louder and call out a little louder? Maybe he's tone deaf today. And he goes on to say, as a matter of fact, look at verse 27. At noon, Elijah mocked him. He says, shout loudly, for he's a god. Maybe he's thinking it over. Maybe he's thinking over what you're asking him. Maybe he's just thinking about it. Shout a little louder. Maybe he's wandered away. Some of your verses, if you're looking at the ESV, maybe he's relieving himself, is what he's referring to there. Which would have been a major insult to attribute human actions like that to a god. So he's ridiculing their God before them. Maybe he's relieving himself, or maybe he's on the road. Perhaps he's sleeping. And maybe if you just shout a little more loudly, he'll wake up. So I feel like Elijah's probably on a roll at this point. I mean, in our minds, we think he's just going to make it all of a sudden, but he's not. As we look at the formulas, you read this, you'll see he's doing everything as God had led him to do. And you see where they cut themselves, these false prophets, they cut themselves, and it's just not working out. And finally, it comes the time of the evening sacrifice, and they're done, and nothing's happened to their offering. And we see, he says to the people, and he prepares his offering, gets the wood there, builds this trench around that can hold 4 gallons of water, and has everyone pour all this water on the whole sacrifice one time. Then he says to them, do it again. They pour water on the sacrifice the second time. He says, do it again. They pour water all over the sacrifice the third time, such that by this time everything's just consumed is saturated with water, so much so that even the trench they built around it is full of water, it's overflowing. There was no water in the first sacrifice, but here it is everywhere. And you know the story. He called on the Lord. As a matter of fact, before he even did that, he took 12 stones. This is before they made the sacrifice. Before they did all this, he took the 12 stones, and each stone signifying each tribe of the children of Israel, which reminded everybody, in the middle of the mess, reminded everyone of the goodness and faithfulness of God. That stone right there, that's for my tribe. We've been walking with God. That's for y'all, for your tribe. That's for our cousins over there. That's their tribe. Oh, remember when the people of Israel crossed over and God protected them coming out of Egypt, and he destroyed the Egyptian army, and it had to bring all these memories of God's past faithfulness. And here they weren't walking with God. This altar now being built back, repaired. And now Elijah calling out on the one true God and asking God to come and to consume this offering. He says, look at chapter 18, verse 36, in the middle of that verse he says to God, he says, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, that at your word I have done all these things. So it wasn't his plan, this was God's plan. So you try to use this to go prove everybody in your workplace that, and we're going to build an altar tomorrow night, we're going to have a campfire before the snow comes, or as the snow comes, and y'all going to call on your God, and I'm going to call on my God, we're going to see whose God's the real God. Well, no, you don't do that, because this was God made this plan apparent to Elijah. This was the specific time, this is God's plan this time, and God did this. You fight God's battles God's way for you, not the way necessarily Elijah did it. So he calls out, he says, answer me, Lord, answer me, answer me. And he says, answer me so that this people will know that you, the Lord, are God. And that you have turned their hearts back. We got a dog, Davis, who, he's lived in the South. The boy's from Atlanta. He's lived in Savannah. He's lived all over the South. The boy knows thunder, right? My dog, he knows thunder. But he's just the biggest baby. Have you ever been to Florida in a thunderstorm? Have you ever been to like New Orleans or Charleston or somewhere way deep down south in a thunderstorm? I know we get a little thunder up here. It's like, boom. We're going to be like, boom, boom. well, yeah, okay, once every 10 years. But like a real thunderstorm, like man, we're going to die thunderstorm. My dog knew that stuff back in the day. He knew that. He got up here, I guess he forgot, and one day I had the back of my Tahoe open. I was working, and I had the back of Tahoe open. A little thunderstorm came in from the north towards Auburn, came down, and it was like, boom, the thunder was. And my dog, he got all scared. He jumped into the back of the Tahoe, made his way past the middle seats, made his way to the front, and decided he's going to sit in my seat, the driver's seat, because he was proud that he can get in there in this big thunderstorm and be safe, right? And he looks over me. I got a picture, just smiling like he got it. And so I mean, here's think of calling on God. Would it be a lightning strike and a thunderstorm, or would it actually be just literally fire coming down from heaven? It doesn't matter. God answered. You see there in verse 14 and verse 38. Wow, I was way off. The Lord's fire fell and consumed the burnt offering. It consumed everything, the wood, the stone, the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And verse 39 says, when the people saw it, they fell face down and said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. What does this remind you of? This reminds you of verse 24, the last verse of chapter 17, where we see that widow who had once declared, you have brought pain on me. You have hurt me. You have killed my son, which would be implying your God has killed my son. Now declaring, as her son came back to life, your God is true. You are a man of God. God is true. He is faithful. He lives. And now the people who had not been following God, who'd seen all the symbolism, here was this one prophet who, before all this happened, he says, I am the only prophet remaining. And here are your 450 prophets, and I'm declaring right now, you want to follow God. They're like, they're quiet. And now, God has made it clear, in spite of their unfaithfulness, in spite of them having the mess and not seeing God in the mess, in spite of them seeing everything that's not working out and seeing all the pain the past 3 years and still not turning to God, and now God, in His grace and in His goodness, while they were not walking with Him, and you think about your own life, the time when we're not walking with Him, that He would still be patient with us, that He would still speak, that He would still give us the opportunity when we're not seeing that He's a good God, when we're not seeing with our own eyes that He is a faithful God, when we're not acknowledging Him, when we're not following Him, that He would continue to move. And that's exactly what He did with these people. And in the end, He did the same thing with them that He wants to do with you, that you would come through that and see His grace and His faithfulness, His grace in bringing you, as we're going to see next week, the rain when you still didn't deserve it. And showing you this mighty miracle this one day, that you would declare it at the other side, on the other side of that. What we should have declared in the beginning. The Lord, He is God. He is good. He is faithful. God, I pray as we think about our own lives, we can see that we forget your faithfulness so quickly. And that's what leads us to worry. That's what leads us to fear. That's what keeps us from checking those thoughts at the door of our heart and letting those thoughts come in and consume us and make us be a different person and make us bring us to the point of having conflict with others and bring us to the point of not following you. God, would you do as you did here? Would you in your grace speak even when we're not listening? Move when we're not looking. Show us your faithfulness. We know that you do. Help us to see. Help us to see that you're good and you're faithful, and God, that we, because of your faithfulness, your patience with us, we come back and confess our sin, and that we would seek out you and follow you and look for your word. We've got it right before us, the Bible. And that we would tomorrow Friday and Saturday and again on Sunday. Not talking about church, yes, going to church, but each of us individually getting into your word every day, reading it. We don't have to have some special sign like this. We've got your word. They didn't have the word like we do. Yes, if you choose, you can do special signs and wonders, and we thank you. You can do that. But God, thank you. But we don't have to have that because you've given us the Word of God, your word, so that we can know you. You are speaking. Lord, help us to listen.